Minnesota. So Karen was elected as an out lesbian in 1980 and is still serving today, 36 years later. Her website identifies her as the longest serving out lesbian in the country, but I have to believe that's GLBT elected official probably in the world, because after 36 years in office, I don't know who's been around longer than she has.
I grew up in southwestern Minnesota, Rock County, it's called. It's one of the most conservative counties in all of Minnesota, it turns out. My parents were sharecroppers, and my mother was just a wonderful person who gave me a lot of
How do you feel about that?
fire.
And I said, oh, go to it.
I was very involved in college in the anti-war movement. My degree was in nursing, and I did public health nursing for the first few years. My first job was out in the migrant worker fields out in western Minnesota. And then during the winter, I took a job back in St. Paul, where a lot of the migrant farm workers had settled. It was during the time that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and the Young Patriots in Chicago and elsewhere were setting up community-based health clinics. So we took a whole busload of people down to Chicago, visited those 3 organizations, came back and set up an organization. And today it's called La Clinica. In those days, it was called the Westside People's Health Center. It's ongoing. It's one of the things I feel very proud about, having been involved in the startup of it. And it was during that time that I was really coming out, slowly. During that time, I was figuring it out.
And sometimes you need shelter and a space to be.
Women's Coffee House was a place where lesbian women could find each other, have a good time, and do it in a sober setting. We had dances and so on. It was basically a lesbian feminist gathering. One of the things that Lesbian Feminist Organizing Committee decided to do was to have a forum at the coffee house to talk about whether or not LFOC should get involved in electoral politics. And it was very interesting. The months leading up to that, the question was like, well, isn't politics kind of a dirty place to be involved? Shouldn't we be more pure and not get involved in that? Or is it a place where we can have some strategies that could actually help us move in some of the directions that we need? The coffee house, you could have, 50 to 100 and some people there in any given, it was a Saturday evening gathering. We had a good crowd, and as a result, we made a decision that we would get involved in electoral politics.
Change in this country is made not by a few heroic leaders, but by movements of people who understand where power comes from.
And there was one group called the Farmer Labor Association who particularly took note. The Farmer Labor Association said, we want to run somebody for the legislature. And they sent their emissary to me and said, would you consider running for the legislature? I mean, I just laughed. I just thought this is the most ridiculous thing. I'm much more comfortable. I've been out in the street in these anti-war protests and other lesbian feminist things. And so after I got done laughing, then they said, well, wait a minute, we're very serious. We want you to be our candidate. So I thought, well, if I'm going to run, I'm going to win.
And when everyone is racing and you join,
We need leaders with courage.
if you can, try running with a smile.
Madam Chair, members, I would certainly rise to strongly oppose the Stryver Amendment. Historic thing that people often put in a introduction of who I am is, and she's the longest serving openly lesbian gay person in the country. And that's true in terms of elected officials. My partner of 26 years when we got married, her name was Jacqueline Zeta. I had met her shortly after I got elected. She was an open lesbian, one of the first open lesbian professors at the University of Minnesota, and she asked me to come in and speak to her class. A few years later, a friend of ours brought us together at one of the Gay Pride celebrations and said, hey, I think you two should meet each other. And we sat down and we did meet each other, and we talked. She called me up the next day and said, hey, I think we have something more to talk about. And I thought, that's a new line. That's kind of interesting. Okay. So I love this woman dearly. She's, the light of my life. Of course, before I could get married, almost 2 years ago, we had to pass a law that made that possible. It's really important that we deal with racial disparities within our own movement, and that we continue to look at the fact that women are still not always appreciated within the LGBTQ movement. I just know that there's a lot more work to be done.